Any questions about the last lecture? Or everything forgotten after Easter? Any questions about the lab? Any challenges? Anyone already finished? Okay. So yeah, similar to Ansible, we have seen that Nornir has a lot of plugins we can use. So this is just a list. The big list we will find on the first link, and Nornir Utils is definitely a good place to start because we have, for example, the simple inventory there. We have some simple print result functions. Working with Jinja 2, there is also a plugin, mainly because before version 3 everything was in one repository, one project, and at version 3 there was the decision to split the plugins who are contributed by the community out of the core, and because there was a Jinja 2 functionality, there was then this plugin, but we could just do it by ourselves because it's maybe 5 lines of code to render a template. But yeah, the template is there, it is handy, so we can definitely use this one. Then talking with network devices, the next 3 are probably the 3 biggest ones when we are talking about legacy CLI communication with network devices. We have NAPALM, Netmiko and Scraply. These are just the plugins, but there of course is also then the native Python package where we can yeah, see the documentation and all the stuff. And then there is this Nornir Rich, one of the projects I like because we can have some nice output, we can have a progress bar, but this is not really something that brings us features, it's just nice to have to see. So this link, you can open it. We see here the list of plugins who are registered in this YAML file here. So now, Nornir NAPALM and Nornir Netmiko are the first 2 plugins because it was before, as I mentioned, directly integrated in Nornir and now separated in plugins. If we are then looking at code, we can also see sometimes that this was really integrated. They have some stuff in common. Yeah, they have here, maybe important, we have to see what kind of plugins. We have tasks here and connection. So a connection plugin is responsible to build a connection, in this case create a connection to the device, and it will automatically handle this connection. So if we use a task from NAPALM, we don't have to really manage the connection to the device by ourselves. So the task itself will check if there is already an existing connection, for example SSH. We don't want to have for each task a new SSH connection to a device because the whole login can take some time, and yeah, it's optimized that we can keep this connection for multiple tasks for the same device. Inventory plugins, if we have Netbox or NetAut later here, for getting information, we don't want to have the simple inventory with the YAML files. This one is the utils I mentioned, so you can also go here, check this out. Many times the documentation is not extremely great when we are looking at Python projects. So here there is a link, Nornir Utils. So there we have some simple documentation. In this one you can see we have inventory plugin, we have a transform function for loading credentials. So normally we don't want to have hard-coded credentials inside our YAML file in our Git repository. With this transform function we could use virtual environment variables for storing the credentials and then automatically aggregate them to the host object. Print result, for example, we have a processor here, we have some simple task like printing data, loading JSON YAML. It's also sometimes just good to see how it was implemented here. So if we want to see something, we have API, where the API is documented, and then tutorial where we, for example, load credentials. So here we see we have a Nornir normal code, and then if we have the transform function load credentials, we can, for example, do it in the code like this and add it, or then there is examples with the environment variable. Yeah. But if you want to write your own, maybe here you can check how this is done in the code, and then you can implement your own implementation of what you need. Yes. Yeah. We will probably use a lot in the exercise Nornir NAPALM or Netmiko, these two. You could also, of course, say you want to go with Scrapply. That's totally fine as well. All of my examples are based on NAPALM and Netmiko, but in the end they work all similar. And yeah, it's a good place to start here to see what kind of plugins there are. It's quite easy to create the plugin, so there should be also one of, for example, this one. It's extremely simple plugin. It was also in Nornir 2 point something. There was a task for HTTP. After migration of 3, it was missing. This is a couple of lines just to create a new plugin so that we have this task again, HTTP method. But yeah, this would be easy to do it just for ourselves in 1-2 lines. Here there is a demo.py where we can see how it is used in the end. We just execute the HTTP method, we say which URL and some options. But if we would use, for example, requests or HTTPX, this is also just 2-3 lines of code. So is it really needed for having this plugin or not? Probably not, but it was just that there is the same feature as we had in 2.0 in Nornir. Yeah, so back to the slides if I find them. I would many times there is not really a good documentation. Maybe there is no documentation. I realized this morning in the train, I normally go directly to the code because I know how the code looks. I know most of the code repos. So for me, if I need to know something, most of the time I go straight to the code. But in the end, yeah, we have to find a way how we can work. I can understand that for someone who is not used to Python so much, the code is maybe not extremely helpful in the beginning. On the other side, they're all codes we see are pretty simple code implementations. There is not so much fancy stuff going on. So Python code should be kind of easy to read. But if you have any questions, just send me a message and then I can help you. So the goal, because we need to have something that we can ask on the test, we have to understand NAPALM. We have to see NAPALM, how it is designed, what kind of drivers we have there, which devices are implemented. There are community drivers as well, but this is only for the core repository. And of course, we need to be able to use NAPALM to configure our devices to get information out of them, and the same is true for Netmiko. So for the exam, NAPALM and Netmiko will be the topics. You don't have to use Scrapply or something on the exam. It's just that we have something that we can test. NAPALM, I like the name first of all, and the name was there for a reason, because working with network devices, sometimes you have the motivation to just destroy the whole infrastructure. So if you want to fire napalm on something, yeah. The goal behind here is to have an abstraction layer. So if you work with a Cisco device or with an Arista device, that you have the same kind of data getting from them. So it's an abstraction layer where we, for example, can say, I want to have all the BGP neighbors, and then I get the data structure with BGP layers. There is a lot of regex going on in the code and forming the data structure that it comes back in a abstracted way that is similar or the same for the different devices. So if you work with different devices, you want to, for example, know the layer 2 neighbors with LLDP, you can use a get function of napalm and you will get the same structure from a Cisco device and from a Juniper device. There are some community drivers out there. I'm not sure what is implemented in which one. It always depends on who uses it. But these ones here are the core ones, I say. At the moment, the documentation looks a little old school, but if we go to the latest stable version, it looks a little nicer. So this is the core implementation we have. It's already more than in the beginning because we have Arista with the EOS, Juniper with Junos, and then we have Cisco, the version, the XR, that's the data center, not the data center, the service provider version, where we can have different implementations depending on the backend library. So if we use classical CLI, for example, for the Nexus or for the iOS, we use Netmiko normally here. So this is legacy CLI commands, and then it has to be parsed and regex. If we have an API, what is the case at the Nexus? It's a data center switch from Cisco. Here we have APIs, and there is a library who talks with API, and then we have netconf with Yang. You have heard about, but not really going into details. We will have a lecture on Yang and netconf, resconf later in the module. Then we use, for example, NC client as a backend library. So yeah, the idea is to have abstraction layer to get data in the same format for different devices. Yes, question. Text FSM. So the question was that gathering VRF information is not supported by napalm. How we can do this now? So one option would be make a pull request, implement your own get function, and make it work for at least 2 different platforms, so it can be accepted. That would be the nice way to do it. But of course, you have, in the end, if we are talking now in our lab with our legacy CLI, we will have to do some screenscaping. We have our own lecture about screenscaping, where we will see libraries like TextFSM, who is a state machine developed by Google, who is now used with a template for generating data, structured data from tables, for example. But yeah, you have then templates to kind of do the magic regex stuff to get your data format. If you need to have this in multiple devices, you have probably to do it in multiple devices. There is a collection of TextFSM templates, for example, where people have already done a lot of work. I can share you the link afterwards. However, we will see in the screenscaping, to have a stable version, we need a lot of testing, because an iOS upgrade or any upgrade can change the output if we do a lot of regex. this can affect something. But we'll also see that screenscaping has some really fun stuff when vendors are doing magic stuff with time formats. So what I've seen is building in the lab something that works, and then when it's running more than a week, the time how its display changes, and then the regex does not work anymore. So we have to consider all of this stuff. So yeah, it's better to have a huge community who works together, because all of these special cases. But coming back to your question, here if NAPALM does not support this abstraction layer for this data you need, you have to implement it by yourself. One option would be with NAPALM and the CLI, and then you have to pause it. Or you can use, for example, Netmiko, who has free parser integrated. It would be TextFSM, TTP, and the PyATS Genie parser. You can see which one has the best support for you need and use them. Yeah. Does this answer your question? Yes, in the project you can definitely combine them. You can use NAPALM for getting facts, all that stuff you have and is supported, and then you can use another connection plugin, Netmiko, for other tasks. You don't have to use one plugin. You can use multiple plugins, you can combine them. The only thing is that there will be then 2 SSH sessions open. But better to have 2 than 100 to one device, but that should be fine. Yeah. Here in this documentation you see which kind of getter are supported by NAPALM. So there is probably no one for VRF, I say. But there is one for network instances, by the way. And network instances is supported by iOS and AOS. So I would say here we have the VRF informations. It's another name. Network instances. So what I normally do is I go directly to the code, but there should be also here in the GitHub NAPALM. We are working with the iOS. We work with the iOS driver. I go here to the iOS and then network instances. So get network instances, sends a show VRF detail and the show IP interface brief, and then it does some screenscaping, and in the end we will return the network instances. So here, network instances, you will see the VRF name, the type, and the state with route distinguisher information and which interfaces. That's probably the information you want and you need. So yeah, NAPALM has some stuff because NAPALM has the goal to be multi-vendor. If we are in a Cisco world, sometimes the naming is different. So also what we will not see here is CDP, right? Because CDP is Cisco proprietary protocol, but we see LLDP, who is the standard. Yeah. Okay. So this here is when we would look at the hello world of the NAPALM, how to work with it. We import the library. We have a help function get network driver. We say we want to have the iOS driver. That is just that we don't need to import directly the right driver. That's handy if we work with different devices with different vendors. Then we can define the properties we need for connection. In our case, we need a host name, we need a username and a password. With this library here, I can just generate a prompt that I can enter the password. If we want to have a simple script, and we run it by hand, that is okay. And then here what we have is, with this driver, we have a context manager with with. So that means on this object here, automatically the enter and exit is done, so connection opening and closing. Otherwise, like a file, we would have to open and close it by hand. And then we can use the get interfaces, for example, to get the interfaces data structure. And we could also get the ARP table. So this is fine if we work with one device. If we work with 100 devices and we just would do a for loop, it will just take a long time, but it would also work. And Nornir now would really help us to make this more, how can I say, flexible. We have the inventory, we can define the properties we need for the connection in the inventory, and then we can run these tasks. So yeah, this is now the same example with Nornir. We have the init part here to initialize the Nornir object. We run on all the inventory hosts in this example, NAPALM get, and what is here is more or less just attributes, the property we give to this task. So we are sending interfaces and ARP table to this task. We would have to see how this is implemented, and we would see that it just makes a get underscore and then interfaces, for example. And then of course we can print this result, for example, for each host. But this one here is done normally, depending on our configuration, in parallel, maybe with 10 workers, maybe with 100 workers. And here is just then printing out the result if we want to. Important is that we here run this task and we import this. We don't have to think about the connection itself. The connection is done by this task. It will see if there is a NAPALM connection already existing, or it will create one in the memory. But in the end, you have to run the code and to debug it sometimes. Question? So the question is, what happens if you have multiple Nornir run with the connections? You have on Nornir this function close connections. By default, it will close when the script is finished. But you can use Nornir and then you can use close connections, or you could also use the context manager like here with the Nornir object. Then the exit will automatically disconnect all of the stuff. If you run multiple Nornir, you have to see that if a task is failed in the Nornir context, it is flagged as failed. So in the next run, the script will not run on the failed host. You can reset this as well with a helper function on the Nornir object. Yeah, just to be aware that we track failed hosts so we don't run task again. Or we can, when we run task, also say we want to run only this task on failed host with a flag. We have to see the documentation for that. Yeah, Netmiko, pretty similar. We also have here a context manager where we directly could work with Netmiko when we send, for example, send config from file. We can just send a template or a file with configuration. But there is also send CLI commands. There are a lot of functions as well we can use directly, or then with Nornir. So in Nornir, there's this plugin. Netmiko, we have, for example, send config. We can use send file with this file, but we can also use just a render text. So there are different functions. We can see in the code what we have, and we can send it. Also here we don't have to think about the implementation and the session handling. So if we go back here and we go to the Nornir repository, The README at the moment is not extremely verbose, so that would be a good pull request maybe to add some examples. But if we go to the code, we can see tasks. So this is what we normally include. So for example, we have send command if we want to send the CLI command here. So we would just run the task, and everything that after the run comes is added here. We see the KV args. This is then passed to the CLI. So if we go to the Netmiko configuration and see what kind of documentation the send command has, there are a lot of parameters we can use, like timeout. We can change all this stuff is passed here. So we can, if we know how Netmiko works, we can all these arguments use in our task as well. And this line here is the magic who happens to see if the connection is already here or a new one has to be created. The question is how he knows if execution has failed or not. So here Netmiko will raise an exception, and the execution will catch the exception, and in the result object of Nornir you will have the failed true property, and you will have exceptions and the real exception. The result object is generated when the task is executed by Nornir, and it will catch the exception and fill in the result object. So an exception in Netmiko will not throw everything apart in your Nornir script. You have to then take a look at the result, because these exceptions can also then be in parallel, and if you in your code would need to catch all the exceptions, you kind of need to implement the parallel runner by yourself. So yeah, the exception who is coming from a plugin or from a task is catched in the result. That's a good question. Yeah. Yeah, so here we have the send command. If we then go to Netmiko, if you see him, pay him a beer. He has done a lot of great work with this library. Yeah, here is definitely more documentation, how we can use it, tutorials, examples, getting started, and if we then check out what is a good starting point, Netmiko examples, like this one here. We can see different parameters we can use. Sometimes you have to work with the enable mode, so if I highly recommend to just use on Cisco privilege mode 15 on the user, so you directly end up in the more privileged mode where you can execute all the commands. But sometimes you have still legacy configurations where you need the enable mode. Then of course the password needs to be passed to the library. That is also something we can do. Send command. Just let's see if we have some more examples. For example, here we can use here the parameter use text FSM. You will see in the lecture about screenscaping what this exactly means. But yeah, we have a lot of options with send commands, and in our task we can also use them with the KV args. It will be passed to this send command. Questions? In the end, you have to implement some use cases. You have to play with it to get a feeling. One thing I want to say again, you don't have to handle the connections with Netmiko or NAPALM by yourself. Even if you make your own tasks, in this task you can then run NAPALM or Netmiko tasks, and they will take care of the connection. So what I don't really see any reason for your exercise to have any direct NAPALM or Netmiko command with the connection. So please use always the connections provided by these plugins. Otherwise, send me a message, we can make screen sharing and see the use case. But we want to have the connection handled by Nornir with the plugins. How can we send information to our plugin? We have seen these connection options, and this is on each host or group or default a property we can set. For example, we could make a vendor group, let's say Cisco, and we can define username password on the first level. Then it will be passed down. But if we have, for example, two different ways to communicate with a device and we have two different passwords, we need to be able to specify them. So we could also specify them on the connection plugin level at the end. This here is the name of the plugin. So for example, NAPALM or Netmiko. If you create your own connection plugin, you have to have this static variable where you define the name of your plugin. And extras, here this is just a dictionary. This is everything that is not already defined, and we can then send this information to the plugin, and the plugin can do something with this. So for example, Netmiko, we can send timeout counters or numbers. We can send special properties for logging to the host. I have here as well an option or an example. We have router 1 and we want to use NAPALM and Netmiko, and because we want to log each character sent through SSH to the device in our file, we can use the Netmiko feature session log, and we defined everything that Netmiko sends and receives needs to be in this file. And with Netmiko we can do this directly in extras. In NAPALM, the NAPALM has decided to have, I think, 4 different properties: username, password, timeout, and optional args. So there we have to put it in optional args, and then we can send this information also to the underlying library. By iOS it would be Netmiko. So this is just an example how we could define this. The result will be we have a file router1.txt where everything who goes over SSH by Netmiko is logged. Yes. So the question is, how do we handle with NAPALM, optional orgs, different vendors with different background libraries, right? So how we can handle this is we have to specify these options here for each device then, or device type. We would make probably a group Cisco iOS, and there we defined the optional extras for the iOS driver, and then we would make one for Arista, or we would for Juniper. So we have to be aware that these options are depending on the driver, on the background library most of the time as well. We would see this in the documentation, by the way. So in the documentation we have the example with optional arguments, and this is just a list of stuff that could be in optional arguments. And for example with Cisco, everything else who is not here can then be passed to Netmiko. So this is driver dependent. That's the reason why it is in this optional argument, and we have to manage this for each driver. We have to know which driver we have on the host. Yeah. Other questions? One good thing is, if you get annoyed about documentation or missing documentation, everything is open source, so just create a pull request if something is missing. Or make an issue, you can even tag me, and if I cannot sleep, maybe I can make the documentation. Other questions? Okay, so this is a really simple one, but you will probably also need it in your exercise. So the Jinja plugin has two options: template from file or from string, depending how we want to have it. Normally, if we would work in Python with Jinja 2 templates, we would, this is more the, there is even a smaller version where we get directly generate the template from a string, but here we want to have more options, like we want to have a file system loader. So everything in the directory templates will be used for lookup of templates. So in our case, in this directory templates, there is a template.j2, and with this environment, this Jinja 2 environment, we can define the loader and all the stuff. We can also define these trim blocks. As you remember, on the Jinja 101 webpage, you can set this option as well. Everything is kind of this environment option. In every environment, we can also define our own Python filter plugins or filter functions and register them to be able to use our own Python functions in the template as a filter. All this stuff. This is code we would use without any Nornir, right? And if we would use Nornir, we just install this plugin. We have the tasks here, template file or template string, and we have to run with the options. We can define where the template is, where the path is, so it directly will use file system load, but we could also override this function, and we can add variables we can use then in the template. So in this template we could, for example, use the variable module and topic. So this is also pretty simple thing. Questions so far? Anything missing to connect for the lab? Yes? It's in the service description, or where is this IP address? Ah, in the graphic. Okay, okay. Ah, okay, okay. I see now the. Let me see the graphic I sent you. So the question is this IP address, where this comes from. So in our lab we have 3 sites, and site A is special because we have 2 routers in the same site. What we normally use here are first hop redundancy protocols. So what we want to have is a default gateway for the hosts, and if one of the router is going down, the default gateway still should work, because on a host we can only normally we define one default gateway, and if this gateway is not available, we would not have connection. So in this Cisco lab, or with the Cisco equipment, what I used was this protocol HSRP, Hot Standby Routing Protocol, if I'm not mistaken, and we have a virtual IP address, this standby IP we defined on the configuration, who is shared between the 2 routers, and there is a priority to say which one is primary, which one is secondary, or the master slave. if we are still allowed to use these terms, where then a virtual MAC address is used. And they are communicating with this HSRP protocol with each other, and if one decides that the other one is not reachable anymore, it will overtake the virtual MAC address and responds to this virtual IP address. So yeah, this is a special case. If you are struggling with it, I would recommend to start maybe with site B and C. They are kind of straightforward because there's only one host, and here we have one thing is we have then the switch who is unmanaged, where you have to configure the VLANs by hand, because virtual switches are not extremely nice and stable to work with, and before you spend a lot of time automating them, I decided to take them out of scope for the automation part. But still, I wanted to have something that is a little more, how can I say, some more advanced features with this hot standby protocol, and yeah, so this IP address comes from there. Any other question? So then let's use this 3 minutes for another example. So let's say we want to use this getter here, right? This get network instances, but we want to use it in Nornir. So what I would normally do is Nornir NAPALM. Writing is difficult. Here we have the documentation folder, so there is a documentation here, but we can also go to the code, plugin and task, and now we see, for example, we have this NAPALM get. We can import NAPALM get and use this task. A task function, if you remember, always has first this task object. If we create our own task, we can use then this task to get the host information, task.host for example, or we can use task and then run to run another task. So we could make our own task function collecting information, and then we can run multiple tasks inside, as you have seen in the first lab with Nornir, just with simple tasks, not with connectivity tasks, but it works exactly the same. And then we have the result object we can work with as well. So here we see that we have this get underscore, where we try to find on this object driver we have from here on the device to find this get underscore. So what we need is to import this NAPALM get, and for get network instances we would need as a getter list the NAP instances, network instances without the get, and then this code will execute the get network instances and will return the data in our result, and in the result then we can access this dictionary with the code. This is maybe a little fast and abstract. You have to write some code. If you have any error messages, don't hesitate to send me a message. I cannot promise to answer 24/7, but I think my response time is not bad. If you have any questions, yeah, just drop me a message. Any other questions? Okay, thank you very much.